that occur in the low numbers. That's the real challenge for NAF, right? But I'm just saying, started something that we're really good at, in the aviation, and maybe, and I think Mets with the internal Met staffs are doing a lot of that. They're doing a lot of that. They're engaged with their traffic flow, their managers, their dispatchers. They're saying, we got to do something about this thing. Now, I don't think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not going up there with a number. You're saying, this is the thing you got to pay attention to, right? You've done graphics, you put things together, you set up a process by which they pay attention to this more than they would on an air mass thunderstorm.
Yeah, I would say on the big events where you feel some type of action, more of the daily stuff that we talk about is a little bit more in his interest and quantify what does a 20% risk of fall to the lightning, we can't even make up the slightly. So it depends. So what you were saying, when there is high confidence, we don't bother. It's really a message of this is a high impact event. Man, the point you just raised, 20% forecasted product. I'll allow us to not talk about convection per se. It starts with that, James mentioned reliability. We can truly trust that 20% is 20%. That's a foundation. And then you can start doing other ones. What's the cost? Every time it comes out, the cost associated with that. But that's a good way to kind of consider forecasting being concerned. What I like about this conversation is that we're willing and recognizing the need and opportunity to open the aperture a little bit and revisit what we have on the books right now on uncompliant requirements. I guess I want to come back to a question for Randy and then look at the online folks. It's not Brandon, sorry. Brandon, if we had a desire to go back to revisit requirements for convective weather with TFM and how we're going to assess and measure forecast still for those requirements, is there an opportunity to do so, and how would that kind of get kicked off?
Yeah, I think there is. The question is obviously the complexity with change and implementing things like that. But some of the things I mentioned earlier, I think there's a appetite for it, and absolutely am willing and eager to take some of the things we've talked about here back with me, and try to integrate them into these conversations about how we evolve. The one thing I know we talk about BNATs, about the new air traffic control system and the desire to jump in on that. I will tell you right now that the conversations we've had, it's an infrastructure upgrade. There's a lot of focus on replacing communications and wiring and the weather piece. It hasn't gotten there yet. I hope it will. I'm just as eager as everybody here that will come. But BNATS is going in phases, and this first phase really is just modernizing the stuff, the wiring and the radios and the communications. So just, we just have to understand that and, be patient with that. But that's something we're working toward for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. Maybe BNATS is the right target to start as well. That's the first time show up to the show, unfortunately. But maybe like the Northeast Swap event in CDM, like, is there already rallying some of these other tools where like FMD, some of these new decision support capabilities, this whole notion of, and every day, the operators in the room and in the NAS are using these forecasts to optimize, make sure that they meet their bottom line, their customers and passengers get them going, and it still seems like there might be some other avenues to at least kick the tires to Rick's point before. Have that conversation again, but I'd like it to be more structured engagement, less conversationally, and more about driving towards justifiable outcomes. I think it's nice. I think that's probably the thing. So, Should we go online? See if wants to tee up your questions.
Poor Jason Baker had his hands up for a half hour. And he still has his training.
It's gonna fall off my arm here any minute, Matt. So good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and so good morning to the folks still out west. So yeah, just I'm putting some thoughts here in the chats as well. But I do like the suggestion about a Tiger team. I think that may have been Mike that brought that up. I think if we do that, yeah, I think we need to look for an avenue. And I don't know, Brandon, what your thoughts on this is. If this would kind of start to dovetail with the wet and kind of tie it in with the CDM community, because you got to get operational buy-in. I mean, you know, a bunch of meteorologists sitting in a room trying to figure out, you know, what products that people are going to use, you know, is only going to get you so far. I also want to make just a little kind of a comment about, you know, I think at some level, you know, I know we all have our individual products and things of that nature, and that's probably never going to change. But, you know, a common platform, you know, I think of the AWD is something that hopefully folks are mindful of. We are developing new products. We got the convective weather avoidance polygons that are going to be in the AWD. It's very TCF-ish. I wonder how that's going to, you know, kind of evolve here in the near future, because there is some overlap there, at least in my mind. So definitely more of a data over products type of person myself. I'm not saying we should get rid of products, but I do think there needs to be some synergy between the data and the products that that start to flow out, and then of course some metrics, which is kind of like the start to all this. So a lot of different pieces of this puzzle. But if we do form a Tiger team, I really do think we need to have a pathway into the FAA to help advocate for the implementation of that, and not just have a plan to make a plan. I think those are my main points. But yeah, great discussion.
Jason.
So nobody, oh, sorry, Scott Minnick has his hand up. I apologize.
Yeah, would you guys mind if I shared my screen real quick?
Go for it. Okay, Marty.
Sorry, gotta jump in here real quick. Kind of show you some of the stuff that our ASB folks, especially Jason Godwin, Rod Hepner, were working on last August. Can you see my TCF screen?
Yes.
Perfect. So just using the August 7th as an example, and Rob and Jason are very open to sharing slides from this experiment before I forget. TCF deterministic, sparse areas that we were showing earlier, but let's dig into the data a little bit more. So we don't only use the HER. We love to use a probabilistic approach to TCF forecasting. That's using the HREF, that's using SREF, all the data that's out there. We're not just looking at one deterministic guidance to use. So here's how that day looked overnight from just an HREF perspective. So you can kind of see where the forecaster got the idea of what was going to happen. Obviously, there's some blue up here where one of the particular pieces of guidance, I'm not exactly sure which one that is, may have been picking up on that in Iowa, but the bulk of it was down into Missouri. So looking at what Rob and Jason put together last summer, we had a lot of great feedback from CWSU community, FAA, et cetera, on this product. So this is actually looking at more of a probabilistic uncertainty component with more of the colors that we're talking about. So you can kind of see some of the data that went into the TCF that morning and why those decisions were made. But ultimately, it's August, it's weekly forced, it's mid-morning. The guidance is just not going to handle it well anyway. So we're using the tools that we have. So I just kind of wanted to highlight, Jason's not going to get a chance to give his presentation kind of like we were hoping, but if you all want any more information about that, please reach out and we can get that to you. But just wanted to throw this out there since we're talking a lot about uncertainty. Didn't really get to talk about this a lot with the first session, but that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. This is a great example where the requirements on the books and there's no thought about the requirements in building that forecast, which is fine. If that's speaking towards what the need really might be. And we should have again a doubling down. What does it mean to define requirements, apply to requirements, build requirements that are more functionally digestible, serviceable to the operation. Even what the hell is that? Right? I mean, that's such a loaded statement. I'll come back to the performance-based weather standards coming out of ASTM for a second. I bring up this example all the time with that. Drive that concept. What I love about those standards that are coming out is first and foremost, let's just for the compliance aspect of it. I always talk about how zip lines operating. I don't know what the numbers are. Take those Franklin 10,000 week, maybe more flights, and they have their own in-house tools that on the standards tiers would be like a -2 in terms of beating it. But that's okay because they have a concept of operations that they're going to struggle with codifying TFN and define mitigation should they experience some of these weather situations. So it's not that if the weather doesn't show up, it's its fault. It's still the operations fault. To Brandon's point before about CCF was being judged on its accuracy, not on its performance. We still have to have some of that give and take here. We have those requirements that were on the screen before. They are so specific. It's so resolved. It's so detached from system delivery of the NAS when it's impacted by weather that we just walk right past them. So we have to have this mindset of, yeah, let's have requirements. Let's have something that's realistically aimed towards the operation. But it's a big win just to be able to report on performance. Whether you comply to it or not, it shows whether it's within a space or not. And I've come around to enjoy the tiers of the ASTM weather standards because at least gives you a way to bucket these things and know what I'm using relative to my mitigations. And again, it's not perfect, but it's different. We have to think a little bit more differently about this. I'm going to give Randy, then Mike, then Brandon the last word, and we can wrap up. So Randy, final thoughts, please.
Yeah. Mike, you just kind of hit on exactly what I was thinking there at the end as well, that you know, we really should start looking at maybe doing some performance-based standards, or at least looking at that as a viable option. And the last thing is, if we do decide to change these requirements or look into them, I do agree with what Jason Baker wrote in the chat as well. You don't necessarily need to throw out the TCM requirements. There could be something there to at least use as a start, but we certainly have to get the operators involved in this and get what do they really need, and then base it on that. Because otherwise, like I said, we're just, we're doing weather for weather's sake and not for operation's sake, and that's really what we're here for, is to support them. So I'll stop there.
But I would just add, I agree with getting the operators involved, but we have to hold down the fire again, make sure we don't have anecdotal discussions about the so that would be based on evidence and justifying what we need.
I want to put my last few words to the students. You all have heard for the last however many hours a conversation about a problem our industry has had for the last 25 years. You all are bringing a fresh perspective to this problem. You've learned about the problem today, but you also now are an age group that has been completely digital their whole lives. Dig more into the problem, talk to us at the mixer, let us help plant some seeds, some ideas, and go build us something better than what we're doing now. And trust me, there's some companies out there that are trying. We need someone that brings all the pieces together to create one product to help move this aviation industry forward. Well, you guys look like you want to make a bunch of money, so I think.
That's it, my thanks. All right, Brandon, final word to you, sir.
I'm sorry, was that for me, Brandon?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, not much else earth shattering. This was great conversation, and I expected that it would be. So I'm glad that we did this. One thing I noticed, just flipping through the chat, and I was trying to communicate how to, how to state this, and then Kevin Johnston, I think you said it. We already have terminology that tries to communicate uncertainty within TFM, and Kevin's chat in there, possible, probable, and expected. And I agree. That's a place to start by trying to quantify what that means from a Met perspective. So I think that's, rather than try to come up with something new, let's utilize what the user, in this case, the user of the weather information is air traffic. Let's try to use what they already have established and see if we can do that. And I think there's ways we can do it. So that, I think, is an excellent next step to capture from this meeting. I think that was it. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. That's it for us. Turn it back over.
On time. Good discussion. Right, your section. I think we kind of, in our hearts, knew that this is going to be vigorous with change. Yes, we've had a vigorous. So it is lunchtime. I presume that Purdy Q is out front. They are out and ready to open. Wow, in stereo. So go spend tons of money at the food bank. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to reimburse out of my pocket Thursday about $647. So go.
I did want to say, if you haven't yet, if you want to sign up to the Excelsior for today, I'm going to close out at 1, just so we can make sure I'm looking for a place. So sign up for that on your way to your lunch, also out there on the stage.
And if any of you have any interest in the UAS manufacturing, the UAS researching, the UAS, this is kind of cool community, you're gonna want to go. Just say. I say this, if you're just a nerd. If you are like me, you're gonna want to go on that.
And so we're breaking until 1 o'clock?
1 o'clock.
Okay.
Sorry, my bad. Yeah. Thank you. Oh.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
A couple of scratches.
We connect the whole collective theory.
Yeah, you can go down.
Okay.
Down at an angle.
Mike told me that.
What's your?
Yeah.
My number. So it's on.
Yeah. Or this. Want anything, let me know.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I do miss Browns.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's the one, you can't beat there. So that one, and you always have to go to the.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I got it.
Why don't you?
Start to say, we did this.
Appreciate it. Sounds good. You got like an hour, right? Our session kicks off.
We're not gonna start.
What do we moved out, like we started getting something that was out. We looked at the sales size. Yeah, so that's just the part. We're up there, I just said, sure. Speak. I said, answer this. That was for sure. It's right around. It's obviously nice.
Yes. Yes, yeah, well, it's funny to hear him say that, when I used to move down to. There's only this back and everything, the airplane coming back home from the. Because we can set up and somebody's been saying, I don't know. Anyhow, he and I started talking finally. Yeah. On your. What are you gonna go in there? You see it, right? I said, well, I haven't quite figured out where it's. Why would you say that? Well, all the television is the community service phase. We're in a big city or in. Yeah, take it. So I said, we asked them to buy it. It's not, it's really, you know, it's not. Working. It's involved in the mind. And I went the other way. Yes. Oh, yeah. 2D views, yeah. Well, I really, obviously, they have things. Read all of the forecast. I'm back. So, they follow the schedule that, and now I can go through, and I can model things the years, and now I can say, you're trying, what if I do just, what if I just do scenario, what does that do to spec I could all do? Or do I so we can sit there and actually model what the days are like, what is the best, what's the best scenario to them? Those facilities can't be so they're taking people from jobs. Power. Yeah. Yeah. Don't understand this. So this is math, but that's not even Elizabeth was very well spoken, and you know, quite impressive as a speaker. Where she come from before she, her friend was there, I think, her trained for her, about 4 9 across the side. Yeah, yeah. So it's still, it's still a big. Yeah. It's what's a difference. Since she told me. Yeah. But the part of this last session concerns the cynical view that I have become in my own day. Get that type of training. Well, that's right. We have the right to the right directions in the.
Is it at the level of, there's like.
How do they then take that? But they don't. Right. Or it looks like that. So, you know, again, you know, Jason Baker put in the chat, you know, we had this discussion with Congress, we did, we talked about many, most, all of these initiatives 10 years ago. Okay, but we did, and we didn't have the stuff we have today. But, you know, we did execute that. All right, and even if we get our type of team right, and the type of team that gets work right, there's a lot of executions in life. If you just consider. This one. I think, you know, I had done a head count, I'm guessing it was a 40. Typical, typical.
Yeah, me too.
But it's a barbecue. Yeah.
Jamie, how are you doing?
Catch up. Okay, yeah. Busy man, I see. Any ideas for this kind of thing? Yeah, so far, but not, I don't think they really good. Yeah. You know, that we got a number of students from here.
You get better computers.
Yeah, from our barbecue, which is a whole board.
That's fine.
I think it's great. All right.
Yeah.
No, no, yeah. Good discussion.
Yeah, I think it's up online.
I was one that's prices. I think it's a lot that they're gonna flag it with that at 60 table, there's no other crap trying to. You got that on the sheet. Oh, it's one of those. Are you the one with the? Yeah. Yeah, I also made weather observations. That's what I came from. It's, it must have been charging. I have to do it. So the way. University of Denver. Oh, man. Oh, yeah. Go to university or no, where to go? I might never. Oh, okay. Like play hockey or do? Oh, okay. You're right, that's true. Moving up. I think that's 3 years. Yeah, I was looking to speak. What you looking into? Sure, yeah. By, it's not, okay. So you guys. Not man. I'm actually. Oh, okay. Yes, you got me quite a bit of dollars. Or in particular, we choose about South Berkeley building. Okay, so you get it, so it's either offline or. I got into all the airports, I can go to Shopper or Milwaukee. You guys on Waverly, or West. Yeah, I've done that. I'm told, yeah, I was gonna ask, that's what we told the airports, that one here myself. I used to think I was doing it in a different channel, but no, I don't. No, it's that's line 135. And slow, flyer this thing once. You heard it. I don't know if you were about cross country for my commercial say, especially here, 77, sorry. Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's.
So you're either a monster or.
No.
This bad, okay. They would have totally gone because they were afraid. We found the end of the story. That was the end.
Well, that was it.
Everybody wants to be good. Take the class up.
Yeah, or they have, sort of like to, kind of like their
Pick up certificate.
go out the front door, and make a lot.
They were afraid. But somebody was.
And they will tip, I mean, I think that's kind of lighter, like, but also to the turn.
But isn't that a great story? You never crossed the line. That's why, that's why. And then. First for. I can do that. Yeah, I haven't done it like that. They're just. I'm not worried about you. No, I studied for the UT, but I don't know that. Well, good, yeah. So where you go? So you're. I think so. There. Pretty much. Springs. There's a point there that. That's what the awesome church. Yeah, it's awesome. That's the information plate. So great. Yeah. And whether she's traveling or she's but they're not sure. Yeah, like I know that. Yeah. Wow, very teammates. Yeah. So I will. You were meeting on this. I just want to have maybe. Oh, yeah. Something very important. That was either each is recognized. So, trying to get a great stuff. Yeah, they are funny. There's some good beach checks. You know, I don't ever. It has five baby folks. Like me, just going in for a something like that. So here's the that's no. Yeah.
Let's sit outside. You want to go? Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna grab my water.
Actually, I do today.
Yeah. Right. I mean, yes. That. Oh, so. Give me the page to show. So you hear this back, whatever. I mean, they did thousands of different things. For the whole briefing from. See, if we do that, you. Eliminate the benefit. Pretty limited. They did this the bargains. That's not what's. Yeah. Now there's things, you know, you learn some financial. Oh,
It's like, yeah. Used to be, things like light out here. Like, when you guys, but it's an annual inspection. I'd say I've got, really bad. So, yeah, the, I can, on ceremonies. When you supply rates. It says it's a, it's, in the end, it's serious. Right. Went in there, looked at the, do the marketing buyers on those. It's so one of the balance and it's all about. Have water shows. So, some of the answers are long. And, you know, just go repair this, the valve, makes 1 mesh, 15,000. Yeah, even I mean, no, I didn't, it's just went on board to last month. No. It's something. There, I would like to. I was trying to get I was looking at the weather, I still looking at weather every day. And so, when we moved to an access area. So going back, coming down, perhaps, you know, that's my all started to kind of die off. That's the way going back. Everybody thought it's not trying to reach out to something like that. Forest is actually should like if they yes, that's what you mean. So it's changed. You got any fun? What yours? Yeah. Oh, it's great. That is, I was going to come down and see that. And to take things. And you know, people plan and I was in everybody. I could be, you're a space by you, check that. I was going to send by you. Yeah. So that weekend was the same weekend that we explored on that week. It's like, state wide. Why don't you? I essentially. There's no. Really? So you know where the planning set up, you know, like, solid, sanction. Yeah. He's down. I don't have enough zeros. They give it push. Let's be mad. Each 6 years. Exactly. I still figured out it was. It's I just on the break through fast. So. I know. Also, I swing this. It's what you do is it's certain your educational professional development classes. It's hard for these things for just reading the same. You're actually what's the question told me about here. So requires as a new part of the brain. What's that? As you know, so you know, he's involved in the electricity there, and then he had. I'm wait for a while. I mean, I've seen money, but I like to share my place. I don't really want to go. Well, also, I'm talking about it. That's like that.
I don't think I'm here now. I don't think anybody. About 3 hours here, things are going to be working out a little bit. You want to one way, a lot of ages. Yeah. Why do you get to how is the experience? He's like, just and of course, United Airlines have attorneys. That's the first truck with a he's allowed them to do the view. That's fine. I mean, there you can do a piece of black part there. So it's Brady. There was something like crossing the front person.
I want to run something by you.
Run it.
Project asked Jane if she can go into work. I tell Jane she should go because remember, we want one day vacation. Waiting.
She wanted to go into work now.
Projector want her to go into work for close off.
Yeah. Does she want to go though?
She said, easy, and what are you looking at?
No. It's Jen's call.
Yeah, I know, but what I'm looking at when I'm ready to go on any vacation or any days off or whatever, they can't tell me I can't go.
Okay, well, she gonna make the call. No, I'm serious. It's up to her. She don't have to go if she don't want to. You don't have to go if you don't want to, Jen. If you feel that you shouldn't go, don't go. She don't know what you had planned for the day.
That's what I took, right? 50, exactly, whatever. I was on that. In the stop sign. Going 75. You get our. Wait.
But remember, if your mind said don't you want to do something, I just stick with your mind. That there might be a reason.
First out there, right? So there's actually things like wrong. Oh, it's like. Right. Okay, I didn't want to get started. Short stories there. I don't think we can tell it. I was joking. I see you. You're, you know, what's for so it's like I always fast. So it seems she wants to rescreen. Yep. So we want like you I sort of look at yeah, I know. Right before the 4 days.
Mining intent. Mr. Fraser. I thought you left.
Testing.
Working on it.
Now we can hear you much better. Thank you.
Thanks for the guide.
Loud and clear.
Okay, so can you hear me now with no feedback?
Yes.
Somebody
we-
else? Okay. So for those online, I grabbed a few things that you missed. You didn't miss it that much. So we'll just go on to the panelists here, just real quick. So I'm Matt Wandishin, NOAA GSL, Mike, I hope I was a little more excited.
Sounds better.
And we're gonna be talking about measuring the performance of forecast of convection in the context of airline operations. So we've got a decent set, decent size, excellent in quality of a panel here to discuss this. And we're going to start out with a talk that actually doesn't really touch directly on verification at all, but that's okay. That was my doing.
You're just gonna have to bear with me.
Yes, so our first presenter is Stacy Hitchcock, professor down the road at OU.
Understand while I do this, because I don't want to do this any other way. I'm also going to put a timer on my phone, make sure students will test this is the thing that happened, because I lose track of time.
Just remember to.
Talking to this-
Project. I'm projecting. All right, Al, can you hear me? So my research, one of my research areas is thinking about aviation turbulence near thunderstorms. I'll also say, based on some of these earlier conversations, I also want to plug that I also do a lot of MCS dynamics and nocturnal MCS dynamics, just like general convection. So maybe we can have conversations about that too. So next slide. I'm just really going to give you an overview of some of these things, and I think I see what Matt was thinking when he asked me to do this, and also thanks for letting me do this. But my research, I think one of the things it can do is maybe help inform how we think about what risk looks like and maybe how we're designing our routes or policies or whatever it is around specifically convection and turbulence. So some work that I did, this is the QR code from the paper published last year. We used 200 million ADR reports over a period of 9 years. What we were trying to do was quantify what's the actual risk of flying near a storm. And so what we found, and so this was sort of motivated by those FAA guidelines of 20 miles, the 10 miles for weaker storms or whatever that means, but like 20 miles from what? How do you define a storm? And so this turned out to be one of the challenging questions too. And so this figure on the left, basically it shows the rates of risk drops off. So the y-axis here is literally just think about this is like the risk relative to the background risk. So if it says 10, then it's 10 times the background risk. And so these risks fall off exponentially in the vertical. So the on the right here, in the vertical, no matter how high we fly above storms, there's a risk that's higher than the background risk. So it doesn't matter how high we fly, there's going to be some kind of risk. I also had a slide that I didn't put it, that I decided to remove. It says flying over stratiform is about 10 times riskier. Flying over convective is about 45 times riskier than the background. All right, next slide, please. Actually, click next, because I think there's the big caveat was that this was all storms, all seasons. I just lumped everything together because I wanted to do a big picture overview. And so one of the things that I looked at here, we looked at sensitivity to different parameters, things like wind shear, because this is something, our winds and wind shear, wind direction. I know anecdotally from talking with a few folks that work in various companies that some companies do have parameters around flying upstream versus downstream. So this is something we wanted to look at. We found, I didn't end up showing the upstream downstream one here, but as wind speeds increase, the distance that the risk extends also increases both above and horizontally from the storm. And then next slide, please. The extra slides. Oh, so this is the other. That's okay.
Just a second.
I'll just blab while you do this.
So that was the work from that advanced paper. Again, you can go read about that if you want. We tried to make it in language that was not just like research speak, but I'm also happy to talk about it in non-research meetings at some point if you want. The other work that's going on right now, the reason it's not in the slide deck, this slide deck, and it won't be published with the slides is because it's in current work that's ongoing by current students, and I'm trying to sort of keep that in mind. It's unpublished research. Students. That's okay. So one of my students, Cole Hartman, is working on this project where we're taking that work that we did, that I did in the article that I just talked about, and he's now looking at some of these things that I didn't consider, right? So things like where in the US does turbulence occur? We're seeing higher risk. So on the right is a returning to the middle here is the percent of turbulence that's near infection. Basically, if you combine these two figures, we have the most frequent turbulence near infection in the southeast part of the US. Maybe not surprising to any of you in this room, but we're quantifying these things. But like, what about season or storm attributes or storm roads? These are all things that we are in progress. So Cole's about to defend his master's this summer, and is starting to move on to some of these storm specific aspects. So the season stuff is in front soon. And then finally, next slide, maybe. This is also, I think, maybe an interesting topic. This is some other work I had a master's student when I was in Australia. We were talking about the permeability case. So that's my 5-minute timer. I'll just keep it really brief. I've heard this term shooting the gap. This is where you're trying to fly through stuff. We had a case where there was some pretty serious reports flying through stuff between these two storms in a region where there's clear air. We've been looking into the mechanisms that are happening, and what we're effectively finding is that storms, anvils are at slightly different altitudes, and so you've got anvils that are going like this, so you're actually having significantly increased shear in that layer in between two storms. Stay tuned, I really choose this. That's it.
AC, so again, doesn't directly, this isn't a verification method or anything like that, but
But something to think about when you verify things.
yeah, it's more in line of when we're thinking about forecast of thunderstorms. And, or let's say, even if you're thinking about what coverage, what permeability means. I think stuff like this, the risk involved in the vicinity of a storm is relevant and often work. Okay. So next up.
Sorry. It wasn't, there's all the.
There's more if you have questions. If you have more questions for Steve.
That's my backup for when you ask me things I don't know.
Yeah, and we can go ahead and take questions now. We don't need to wait until. So if anybody has specific questions for Stacy.
Yeah, good work. Mark Fan of Fairlawn Pilots Association. Where do you get your ADR data?
It is from, I have,
Multiple sources?
yes.
Well, but
some of it's not.
okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you had access. Most of us using the publicly available data, we're committed to a couple of airlines, which does have problems in terms of the coverage that we're getting. We did some work for the FAA recently looking at again. Product. I'm not surprised that we saw a lot of stuff in the low levels in the southeast.
Yeah.
Because most of our data is coming from them.
And just to follow on, are you allowed to say which event that was, shooting the gap?
I actually I realized I meant to take the date off.
Okay. Yeah, no worries. I understand.
Yeah, and actually, I part of this is that I'm not entirely clear how much detail I'm in. So, yeah,
I think that shooting the gap, Mike Carroll's down. I think that shooting the gap research is going to be very intriguing. Because you can, as you sit there and you're in the flight deck, and you're going through weather, and you see, and the pilot's just trying to find a way through or around. And even as dispatchers, will suggest that, there's a 20-mile gap, in the weather here, and, it looks good. But I think that research on that shooting the gap would be incredibly I think it's something that we haven't thought about, especially individual dispatchers in the industry. We're just looking at the radar and seeing where there's quote a hole. But, you know, man, you just opened my eyes of holy cow, there's.
Sorry.
No, but it.
Also, I'd love to talk more about these things.
But it's a good conversation to have because, well, we're all still trying to improve. You know, we've only been doing this aviation thing for like 110 years. You know, we're not experts at it. There's more to learn.
One of my provocative questions is it actually riskier to fly through the gap than it is to fly closer, but on a different, like on the north side or on the south side?
Yeah, I don't like with the National Transportation Safety Board. I just have the question, are these just regular incidents or are these any accidents specifically?
I actually never looked to see if there was an accident.
So these are just
related.
high reps?
This is not high reps, this is ADR, so this is ADR that is exceeding a threshold.
You have no idea if they caused an accident.
I do not know specifically whether there was an accident.
John, I was just asking Mark, because I see like that case in July of 2015, I thought was the nose cone blowout of Delta.
Yeah.
Where they were shooting the gap, but in reality, the storm was going up underneath it. And filling in the gap that way, but I thought it was.
Was one in Minnesota comment?
No, I thought it was one, Colorado. Yeah,
This is not covered.
okay.
Well, it's just, looking at our turbulence data, turbulence is still the number one cause of accidents for air carriers. And convectively induced turbulence is, I would say, probably 85% of the cases we're looking at. And just finished one last week was published. This was with a regional carrier, and they were just deviating around buildups. The one that they went through in 50 had tops at 45,000 feet, but the write-up was, oh, we were just deviating around some buildups. The pilot flying only had 750 hours total time. She's flying airfare. Training and so forth, very critical. And again, the tools they were using and so forth, very critical. And of course, that airplane didn't have easy pumps.
Can I add one quick question? With the EDR data set, which is so rich, did you also look at non-turbulence? Did you look at the events where you would have expected turbulence, which you actually got none?
No, but this is something I've been thinking about recently, and I think it's a really good idea. I mean, this is all of my metrics are like quantified relative to the total number of observations, so they're sort of points in. But I think looking at some events where I think there would be turbulence and this would be interesting.
All right, Jason got one on.
Hey, a great and interesting research paper here. One question I wanted to ask is pulled up the link to the paper here, and obviously haven't read it all in like a few minutes here, but I noticed it uses the 10 dBz boundary on there. I was curious if other reflectivity levels were examined, and the reason I asked this is a lot of model output guidance. Some of the MRMS products use 18 dBz echo tops quite a lot, and for example, in Aviation Weather Center's first guess auto TCF product, we're using 18 dBz echo tops and from model output, and then drawing a buffer around those. And we've been going with about, I think it's, I want to say a 15 kilometer, I don't have it in front of me, buffer around that. And so basically this kind of research or paper like could actually help us more appropriately tune that buffer. So I was just curious, like I said, if you've kind of looked at different DBZ levels.
The short answer is no.
And Heather Reeves strapped to her chair.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Heather Reeves is a great person to talk about some of these things. 10 dBz, I actually was thinking, so I was trying to choose something that I thought would maybe represent what a pilot might be seeing from their onboard radar. So I chose looking at a straight horizontal distance, which I know that you can tilt the radar, but basically horizontal distance to its efficacy boundary. So I'm trying sort of emulate, but somebody might have a for that. Whether or not that was the best decision, who knows?
That makes sense. Thank you.
Well, I'm gonna talk about it tomorrow.
Okay. All right, very good. Then we'll move on to James Kenyon, who is with Series, which is Quadrant Institute with University of Colorado, and NOAA GSL, and Wade her and RFS came up a bit this morning. James is one of the developers of those products.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So I work with Matt at NOAA GSL, but Matt is a NOAA employee. I work for University of Colorado.
Sorry, real quick, I need to break in. James is related to neither Chelsea Kenyon nor James.
That's right.
James is still the
Yeah. All right, yeah, let's go ahead, Matt. Yeah, let's talk about, we already talked about the HER this morning, the HRRR, high resolution rapid refresh. It's already come up in earlier discussions. I'm part of the team at GSL that had developed the HER since it was first implemented into operations in 2014, although the development was back to 2009, and then its final implementation was in 2021. It's been frozen ever since, and it will likely remain in operations through 2028. The hope is to retire it then, along with the RAP, assuming this RRFS version 2 can do better. But for this talk, I just thought, let's go back and just see how has the HER done with just some really bulk measures of statistics, going all the way back to 2014. And I just looked at CSI, probability of detection, false alarm ratio. And obviously, when you look at these figures here, and we're applying a 90-day running mean, doing a 40-kilometer neighborhood radius, we're not being quite so strict about getting convective forecasts dead on. We're using a 35 dBz threshold, which is functionally really useful for sussing out convective activity. So every one of these dots is really the distillation of a lot of forecasts. If we're comparing to MRMS radar reflectivity as our observation data set. But the point being, there's a lot of seasonal variability, and no year is the same as the year before or the year after. But I think you'd agree there's probably been a slight upward tick in our CSI over the years, a slight upward tick in probability of detection and false alarm rate, a gradual downward trend in the mean. But it's pretty noisy, and when you look at sort of the absolute scores, they're actually pretty low. And I was surprised. Of course, Matt mentioned the double penalty. James mentioned the double penalty issue with CSI. So in an absolute sense, these numbers are kind of low. And I was also surprised that the delta, the gain over the years, is quite muted as well by these statistical measures. So model developers were pretty well attuned to these figures. Of course, there's not one single version of the HER that was running during this time. It had been upgraded about every 2 years or so. But this is kind of, these statistical measures are kind of what we live and die by as model developers. We're pretty well attuned to how our models are doing in real time. When we're developing prototypes, we're paying attention to how those prototypes compare to their real time or their operational counterparts. So let's go to the next slide. So we develop these models, we pass them off to the National Weather Service. They run in operations for a few years. We celebrate that day when we pass it off and it gets accepted to operations. And no sooner do we pass it off, and our next job is to try to beat our previous work. And we have a few years, a few months to do it. That's the nature of these development cycles. So when we're upgrading models, we're basically trying to beat ourselves. So the way we get there is we have to take our best ideas in model physics and data assimilation, try to run as many experiments as we can in the time we have, and we hope that these statistical measures will help us suss out which ideas led to model improvements and which ones didn't. And the hope is that by doing many model experiments over a few years, we can arrive at the best possible configuration for an upgrade. So here's an example.
and I'm just gonna show CSI and frequency bias for the HER, which is again plotted in red here. But now we're gonna compare that to some configurations that were intended to possibly replace the HER, and this is called the RRFS. I should note these two RRFS configurations, these were early prototypes, so these didn't get implemented, but this is when we were well underway to RRFS development, and we thought we had a pretty good handle on, we're sort of starting to arrive at a final configuration. So we ran these retrospective experiments, and we were liking what we're seeing here. You look at the CSI die-off plot, starting from hour 0 to hour 12, model scale is decreasing with time, seeing a slight uptick with CSI and a more neutral frequency bias. That's broadly telling us that if we have the right amount of reflectivity elements, in this case greater than 25 dBz. So these statistics were telling us that RRFS is probably better than HER version 4. This was a promising result. So let's go to the next slide here. I think that there it goes. Yeah. So we like what we were seeing with this RFS, and but sometimes these statistical measures can lead modelers astray. So I've intentionally left off the labeling here, but this is a three-way comparison, HER along with two of those RRFS prototypes. This was just for a controlled retrospective experiment we ran for a 7-day period in winter 2022, February 3rd in this case, and comparing that with the observed radar reflectivity there on the left-hand side. And you can reach your own conclusion. I would contend that the forecast panel here on the left-hand side is probably the best overall forecast. I think it has the most fidelity with this sort of linearly organized convection across the southern Gulf. Don't particularly like seeing these little embedded convective elements, these somewhat discrete storms out ahead of that main line. And I really don't like that sort of mushy low-end convective signal off of southeast Louisiana. And see if you would agree, and we could even pan out a little bit more. We'll delay. There we go. So same forecast, but we're just panning out. And I again would contend that these two panels here on the right-hand side are not looking too good with this convective structure, this storm morphology, that really this forecast compares most favorably with our observations there on the left-hand side. We were surprised by this result. The preceding two slides suggested that the RRFS were on the aggregate doing better, but when we actually looked into the raw forecast output, we actually preferred the HER. So this was kind of a point where the statistics can lead us astray. There's always a temptation that if I can reduce gigabytes and terabytes of model output to a few skill scores, that will save me time. Therefore, I can run more modeling experiments, and therefore I can arrive at a better configuration. But by relying on statistics exclusively, these verification measures, and not taking the time to go into just looking at raw model output, we can sometimes start going down a wrong path. And so this was caused to sort of reevaluate the RRFS1 version 1. We made it better since then, but it's an example where sometimes statistical measures can reward things in the forecast that do not look plausible to a meteorologist. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Yep, fantastic. Yeah, so I think this is good. I didn't mention before, my regular job is doing forecast verification for the FPAW. There are things that really in the last few years we have tried to emphasize within our own group is the need to look at case studies to supplement what you're seeing from the statistics. So I think regardless of requirements in place and what decision is made in terms of how we're going to measure the performance forecast for national airspace, we've always got to go back and look at particular cases as well, because they just reveal
White Split has a question with Chad that's kind of interesting. It may not be time for it yet, but it says, what is the needed CSI 4 to 5 hours out for decision making based on this morning, or decision making based on this morning.
My short answer would be that's the wrong question, that there's not. The CSI is just not the measure that's going to capture the information that's.
I was gonna raise the same point. I mean, when I looked at your plot of statistics change. Yeah, there's some spread in there on the y-axis from 1.45 to 1.75. But if you look at a bias from 0 to 2, they're kind of all in the noise. I always like to say it this way. To my point, does it amount to a hill of beans operationally? These improvements based upon the investment we're making to this best forecast, right? And I would even say that 12-hour forecast of the case study, 12 hours out, and for aviation, now for severe weather, maybe there's some different states, but for aviation, those are, to me, comparably similar forecasts. They're not going to make any hard and fast decisions 12 hours ahead. You still get kind of a linear sense, a little bit of kind of like the conveyor belt stratiform behind the system. Functionally and severity wise, and that front leading line, it looks better with a hurt. But again, does it amount to a hill of beans in terms of forcing a different, more effective decision strategy? Don't know.
So that's interesting because if we look at the herd forecast versus the other two and we apply, say, measure of permeability, we're going to get a pretty different answer from the herd or those flights trying to cover.
Yeah, but at 12 hours, you're going to make exactly no different decision. So is it worth how much it costs to go to different methods for a 12-hour forecast for aviation when it's going to result in a different permeability answer? But 12 hours out, we're not going to move flights. We're going to wait. Again, the decision is going to be a little bit different already.
Okay, then I set myself up for a segue. By handing them off to our next speaker, Joe Grimm is going to talk, from NCAR is going to talk about what you know about measuring convection forecast performance.
Yeah, I'm Joe Grimm. I've been at NCAR for 18 years.
Yeah.
Convection for about 8 years or so. And this is work that primarily James Pinto and I have been working on over the past year. And I'm going to show 3 different techniques we used in assessing convection radiation interest. So the first thing we did was we wanted to look at convection timing at 430 airports, primarily those on the eastern 2/3 of the United States, because that's where we have a lot more convection. So to do that, we took straight times with 80-kilometer radius.
Close to each other, the microphone.
Okay. So we worked with straight times with 80-kilometer radius, and we tried to see when there was convective onset, peak convection, or cessation of that convection over a period of time using different thresholds. And so if you step forward there, that's the Atlanta airport and the straight line around it. And so you can see there's some convection there. And I highlighted there 35 dBc is essentially the yellows, oranges, and on up. And so you end up with 17% coverage for that. And so using this over the course of an entire summer, last summer, go forward to the next slide. We were able to calculate mean timing histograms. So that's what you see in the chart there are histograms of, what was the 2 models that we assessed, the herd and the Rufus impasse. Were they too early, too late in predicting the onset, peak, and cessation of that convection? And I'm not going to get into the details of the results here, just because in the interest of time, we don't want to get into that too much. But we were able to see not only what the means were, but also the range of values over the course of that summer. And if anybody wants to see more about this, the end of next week, we're gonna be, putting this into final report. We'd be happy to share that. To move to the next one. So we looked at assessing flight permeability. And at first we were thinking about doing just the key jet routes across the country. But then we realized, there's going to be areas that are less flown, but still being of interest. And so we decided to look at 4 primary directions. Essentially west-east, there would be west-east or east-west. And then the other 4 directions that you can see. And we wanted to see if there was a flight of a given length, did it intersect convection greater than a certain threshold during the time that we were looking at, either from MRMS for observations or for impasse. And so we did that not only for a given point with the flight path going through that, but we did that across the entire United States using a range of theoretical flight paths ranging from 100 kilometers to 500 kilometers. And we just wanted to see how frequently convection was encountered and does the flight orientation path make a difference. And so we move to the next slide. This is just an example plot for an 18-hour forecast for that suburb, just showing whether there's biases, and this is for the northwest southeast direction, whether there are biases in different parts of the country and how those ranged with forecast lead time. And so we found these results to be very interesting as well. To the last.
What is the meaning of the red and blue?
Oh, the red and the blue, I'm sorry, yeah, it's positive and negative bias.
Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, you probably can't see the chart on there very well.
Colors right there. So.
And then the last thing we did, which is actually the first thing we did over the past year, was we used an object-based approach to look at counting the convective cells over the country and not just how many there are, but the convective coverage. And then we tried to assess how both the HER and empath models judged the convective count and coverage by time of day in UTC, and that's on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the forecast lead time. Is where each of these boxes are at the valid time, not the forecast time. And I'm not going to get into the details of what these plots show again in the interest of time, but we were able to see some consistent patterns that evolve over the course of many of the events over the summer, where, for example, the going too long overnight, but then once you hit 0Z, then it was able to have a better idea of what convection would be. And then the impasse model had its own issues too, with a bit of an offset for when convective timing would occur. So those are the 3 techniques that we assessed over the past year, and I'd be happy to take any questions or thoughts because we're planning on doing more next year.
Yeah, just a quick comment, if I may. I think this is great work. This goes back to the case that Chelsea teed up this morning, where she knew from her experience that HER tends to maybe give these nighttime, nocturnal jet-driven storms and decay them properly. You have some of the evidence. Now, there have been other studies like this over the last 15 years, where there's an interest, there's some momentum, people do the result, it falls away. It'd be great for this to somehow be information or program to package for decision makers to call up intuitively, almost like it's a cognitive assistant, the forecast and the operators. That's the hard part, right? But this is the evidence that we've been talking about. So this is what's working.
Thanks. So are you suggesting that this would be something that would like run somewhat.
Or even just have a body, this is a good sample size too, it's a large body of evidence, maybe it's limited or whatever. But you don't have to be the Chelsea Kendings of the world that has 16 or 17 years of experience staring at Kansas City airspace to know the ins and outs of when the HER is going to be off. It has the experience for everybody, and moreover, it takes this forward to the operators to understand this in their space a little bit as well. Now, again, the challenge is crossing that chasm, but the biggest problem we have is we're not showing up with the right evidence. Now we're having a different type of conversation about it.
Yeah, go back to the permeability plot. It basically, what you're kind of saying is that there'd be this database where you could say, okay, I really want to know what's going on with the performance at this sector. Click on the sector, it says, okay, typically the permeability is off by this percent. Some kind of additional information that you can then use in your decision.
Yeah, I think it's the start, right? But it starts moving in that direction, which is pretty great.
Yeah, that would be great. And then have something like that where you can see how it changes with season, changes with model upgrades, changes with, is there a linear pattern or non-linear pattern or,
I'll send you guys a paper that some of them was done. It didn't quite have the right. It wasn't quite right. It was done in like 2013 or so. Try to do that. You guys can turn on everything.
Okay, yeah, and I think this is a great step in the right direction, that it is evaluating model performance in some ways that are relevant to decisions being made. I think, Mike, what you're talking about is just getting this information from the people who are looking at the forecast so that they can interpret the forecast better.
That's a start.
Another step is to kind of the next step of this, to move this into decisions. Right, this is part of the type of information that's necessary to make decisions. But if we could then.
You look at a HER, you look at the TCF driven from the HER, it professes a level of certainty that belies reality. This could counter that. Right? This balance it.
I've seen there's a story of comments there talking about the actual timeline for when models are going away and then when models are coming on. So the HER has been around for years and will continue to be.
It's been frozen since 2020, right?
Frozen, yeah. Nothing has changed in the HER for 6 years now. Like similar to the phone in my pocket, but the RFS version 1 is coming on after the World Cup. It's been delayed because they didn't want a new model coming in right before a major event. So shortly after the World Cup, that should become operational. When that becomes operational, several of the other, like the NAV-NEST and the Warfare ARW and some of those things that make up the HRF that NCAR runs, which is an ensemble of, we've got these different models all lying around, let's put them together and call them an ensemble. So several of those members are going to go away when the RFS version 1 comes online to, I guess, so our REFS should come into place with our Rufus version 1, right? Yeah. So that will replace. So we're going to have a high resolution ensemble, similar number of members, but it's going to have very different performance characteristics. It's going to be a single model, so it'll also have a shared bias as opposed to different biases from all the different members. It's probably going to be under dispersive because it's a single model for as well. That's just kind of what we see at this point. They're doing lots of things to try to increase the spread, but it's going to have very different characteristics. With Rufus v2, if the current, which I guess is what you guys were looking at, right? So the Rufus MPAS here is the prototype for version 2 of the Rufus. It's targeted for 2028. We'll see all those deadlines have been dead on my decades. But that's the target, and when that happens, then the HER and the RAP will drop off as well. And there was a recent decision announced by the Weather Service that the global model is going to switch to the same innards as the Rufus MPAS, and so it'll be back to the idea of having kind of a single model, or at least single configuration or type of model being run at multiple scales, which was what they said. So that's basic outline of the model development stuff. Are there any questions about that or any more questions about Joe's work? Or we move on? All right.
What does the World Cup have to do with model deployment?
And it's just a big event, lots of people in lots of places, lots of people in outdoor stadiums. You want lots of travel, so all of that going on, they thought it's not a good time to introduce something new that people don't have experience with, don't have a lot of those built into their space.
In World Cups in the United States. Yeah.
In North America.
Yeah. It's in Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, so that, and it was, they'll do similar things with other, we don't introduce a new model right before Christmas. Things like that, Santa. Plans.
Yeah, you want to,
Yeah, Santa,
you want to stand
Santa,
up.
Santa has his built there, understanding of things. Okay, so next up is Mike Baldwin from SPC and CIRO, which is the Cooperative Institute through OU, and it's in a few different jobs that he's held for that as a professor at EMC, which is Environmental Monitoring Information Service, our name now, but basically, and Natural Weather Service running North American. So Mike is going to give us very different perspective on doing.
Thanks, Matt. Yep. I'm at working at the Storm Prediction Center, so focused on evaluating their forecast products. They have obviously a focus on severe weather, storm reports, but similar ideas of some kind of atmospheric weather, some kind of events, and trying to give various lead time and forecasts and watches. See how those are performing, as well as the numerical guidance that we get from say our FIS and other systems. So I've been working with this data co-op with Matt, and I've been working on these topics. We're going to go through also here with Brooks at the Storms Lab, other colleagues at the Storm Prediction Center. Next slide, please. So just to start, a lot of times James kind of covered this already in the development of forecast systems and numerical models. In particular, we're getting some kind of measure of performance, some kind of statistic, and using that to say that this is better, just worse. But a lot of times that single number isn't really giving us the full information about different aspects of the forecasts and types of errors that those forecasts provide. So if you click on the, should use the text maybe. These measures, these stats really become the basis for making decisions about making changes to the systems. So they're actually, pretty important. And a lot of, say like AI models are actually built by trying to optimize a particular statistic. So you don't really understand all the ramifications of those choices of stats. And I think if we try to take decision making and different types of errors into account, we can at least try to get a more complete picture of performance and maybe the utility of these forecasts to users and decision makers. So I think let me click on that once or twice. Yeah, let's do the next slide. So we've got here what we're calling a cost curve, and we can if we've got some kind of hazardous weather event that we can define, there's going to be some kind of forecast system to give us information about that, to say, predict the probability of that event. And what we're going to do to evaluate that is to look at the different costs of different types of forecast errors. So the cost to a decision maker of a false alarm is going to be a certain amount, and also cost of that decision maker to missing the event, having the hazard occur without taking protective action. It's to the other side of that coin. And on the x-axis there, as you go from left to right, it's going to characterize the decision makers, the different users, based on the relative amount of the cost of the false alarm. So when you're all the way on the left, false alarms are cheap, basically are zero cost, and you're really sensitive to having those missed event errors. As you move more and more to the right, that user is more and more sensitive to a false alarm. So we're not going to just consider one user on one type of decision. We're going to try to consider the full spectrum of users, with the main reason is we don't usually know exactly how many users fit into these different categories. So we'll sort of look at that full range. Then a forecast system can be, if we get the performance of that forecast, we can come up with an overall cost to the user, which will depend on their sensitivity to the missed events of using that forecast. And so that's going to give us a curve space. And a perfect forecast will have zero cost. It'll be showing a line all the way at the bottom. We've got a purple curve on there to represent a typical forecast system, which gives us a continuous value, say 0 to 100%, or some other number that could go from something small to something really big. And you're going to draw a curve in this space. And a lot of times, these forecasts are then, go to the next one now, turned into a sort of a warning. And tornado warnings are an example where you pick sort of a threshold in this 0 to 100 space. You say if it's greater than this threshold, we're going to issue a warning. We're going to draw a polygon. We're going to say this event is expected to happen. And when you do that, you turn this kind of continuous curve to a straight line. And it's almost like a attitude indicator in the cockpit. Your forecasts are going to lean more towards benefiting users that are sensitive to missed events. If you have a lower threshold on your warnings, but if you have a higher threshold of the warning, those are going to lean to benefit users that are more sensitive to false alarms. And we can quantify this if we have the typical verification information that we can get from forecast systems. I'll just say, we've been looking at tornado warnings from the Weather Service, and they do lean more towards benefiting the users that are sensitive to false alarms, which is a bit surprising to me, but that's how sort of been going. So stop there. Questions?
It's one thing to put, maybe to some, but if you think of the sensitivity, you think of the difference of a enthusiast pilot taking a girlfriend on a flight for the first time, first day. He's going to be in that very sensitive to missed events category. If he goes up and he gets bounced around and she gets sick, that's probably the last day as well. The package carriers, right? Packages don't complain about how bumpy the ride was. They're going to be much more on the sensitive to false alarms. They want to raise the market on that. So just to kind of put it some context.
Yeah.
I'll bring it back to this morning's Kansas City example. This is where I was, I love this, by the way, saw it in that spot being nice. I think this is part of the way you go, but here's where I'm struggling.
Yeah.
I feel like we're always at a crossroads of these two ends, so. ATC doesn't pay a penalty for morning shutting down airspace. Now, you always heard about, yeah, I'm an AFP in Cleveland Center because that means I can simply order pizza. That was the advantage, right? But the airlines are very sensitive to that. They're gonna pay a penalty for that. On the flip side, they would rather wait and see at times, because maybe it won't pan out, but if it happens, ATC is really, really gonna pay for it. So it seems like you're always at this two groups that share a decision and are diametrically opposed on what they may want in their forecasts. How do you use this construct to move into shared space? That makes sense, Ryan?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind is that got sort of a continuous forecast and different ends of the spectrum there that use different thresholds for making obviously different sets of decisions. So to try to get more of the confidence, probabilistic type information for as much as the products and machine, I think will help get more into this, trying to satisfy as many users as possible. But it also requires the users to be able to use that information to make I don't want to say the correct decision, but make decisions that are appropriate for their particular use case, based on its probability. So definitely it adds complexity to the system.
Wonder if there's another dimension. This isn't Caesar inducing enough, where you have multiple costs on here as well, like there's.
Well, yeah, this is just a binary decision, right? And that's not actually the case. They're looking at a particular decision maker. We can expand, get how we're going to select it, visualize, but mathematically.
Yeah.
When you get to the multiple levels of cost and multiple user cost loss ratios, that becomes much more difficult. Going back to your first question, I think it's a great question posed to the minority.
Yeah.
No, and by that, it's not just a cop out, but it's also, that's really a question of how decisions are arrived at, right?
Yeah.
Which is different than how you measure the performance of something in
Right.
context.
But this goes back to kind of that whole side of doing your homework on that side too, and showing up with a collective conversation about the problem.
Mike, I think there's a lot of, this is really good, there's a lot of users doing this already, but just at a much broader scale. I mean, you could look at the 10% chance of fog at UPS we talked about earlier. You could look at why we don't see packed airports and winter weather events anymore, because the airlines are willing to cut their losses. And if you know what, that forecast isn't perfect like it once was. It was such a chance of disaster that we cut our losses. I think, you know, hurricanes, we don't leave planes anywhere near that cone of uncertainty anymore. We get them out, even though it was only 40 knots. Well, it was only 40 knots. But I think you could reach out to users and get, you know, it's a broader scale. It's hard when you get into convection.
I think the other thing gets back to what was mentioned, well, you even touched on it. In terms of the big events, it's easy, a huge snowstorm, it's easy for people collectively to come to the same decision. The marginal events, which are much more kind of by definition, happen a lot more often. So your sensitivity to your in the opposite sense, sensitivity to false alarms, is going to be much lower when there aren't that many events to begin with.
But the lessons learned aren't easy. To get people to actually buy into the fact that, you mean, it was only 50 miles an hour. We could have left our planes there. We spent $1 billion to move them all. I mean, so the lessons learned are hard. They're not easy.
Yeah.
Elizabeth Smith, NOAA, National Severe Storm Science. Hello, from Florida. I was lucky enough to go to Harold's seminar earlier this week. The seminar showing some of this earlier this week in the building we both work in. And what this has been all morning, what is making me think about is how many lessons I think a community like this one has to learn from the social science component of this, right? So talking about the translation of an actual forecast into a decision. And that's really what warnings are, right? And there's a huge body of research now after 2011 that's actually looking at that. I think that could be really impactful. But my actual question here is, earlier this morning, we heard about kind of how the requirement as it's defined now is, 2 + 2 = fish. So what that makes me wonder is there really, do you expect there will be relation to what we see in weather warning decision making associated with the directive for how warnings are issued being changed?
Well, if I understand your question, I would say yes. It always boils down to how you define the event and you're predicting or warning. And if we are changing something in the policy for how those are determined, I think that will have an impact on the results and decision making. So I think Harold's point is really needs to think much more carefully about all these issues, policies and how we define the event. We talk about 20 miles storm or radius, include buffer around that for turbulence, things like that. And then the length of the warning is another big issue. Tornado warnings, and got obviously differences from office to office and how those are. So it's the whole system. It's communication.
Yeah, I think a key thing Mike mentioned, or plays back again, the actual requirement statement that was put up there this morning. First step, of course, is defining the event. And if we don't have a good definition of the event, then the statistics matter. Right, so that's one of the key things is defining the event. And doing so in a way that's accurate and useful. We were talking during the break that it could be, I think, okay, well, we need to have permeability, we need to have the timing, and we need to have the right orientation, and we need to have this, and it needs to vary by time of year and all across the country. And whether my grandmother is talking like this today or not, and all this, you could end up with a whole book of statistics to cover all of the different ways to slice and dice it, and then if that's not anybody, essentially. It needs to, that balance of capture comprehensiveness and conciseness. Okay, so that brings us up to our last participant here, Berkeley Gallo, who is with the Air Force 16th Weather Squadron, and unfortunately, the Air Force did not let her travel to this event, so she will be chiming in. So as my fellow Matt, Mr. Franzek mentioned before, Berkeley, I assume you're on. If you could please turn on your camera.
Yeah, my camera, I think, has been on this entire time.
There we go. Now we see. Okay.
Okay, excellent. All right, hi everyone. I'm Berkeley Gallo with the Air Force's 16th Weather Squadron. We do the environmental modeling for the Air Force and our specific end users. My specific flight is the tailored products and applications flight. So we do a lot of thinking about these sorts of problems, making verification and making products that are useful and impactful to our end users. So if we go ahead to my slide, I only have one. And I think it actually picks up on a lot of the themes that we have throughout this entire session. Basically, the first line on the slide, if it will show up. Okay, cool. So the first line essentially says statistics are meaningless unless they tell a story. And I think we had two really good examples of that within this session where we had two different stories being told. So James's talk showed how the stats don't tell the full story. The statistics said one thing, and the subjective, the case studies showed something different, where the end users might feel a little bit led astray whenever they're told, oh no, the statistics say everything is better. However, we also had Joe's talk where the statistics backed up the story that was being told from the individual case studies. So I think those two examples in this very session showed how subjective verification really is still necessary, and looking at the individual cases from user perspectives ensure that we have relevance in our metrics and that we're actually doing the statistics, doing the verification for not just meteorology's sake, not just statistics' sake, but actually for our end users and our customers. This is a really hard problem to get after. I think it was Liz who mentioned that we do have somewhat of a social science problem here, where we have people on the other end using this information to make decisions. And so tailoring those metrics to the problem set or the use case is going to be really important, particularly when we get outside of the field of meteorology. And I think that was exemplified really well by some of the things that Stacy was referencing, where even if we have a porosity measure that's going on and we're verifying that our model is doing great at forecasting porosity, do our end users actually have the meteorological knowledge of what's going on at those storm tops that her student is looking into? Or I heard something this morning that was, oh yeah, I see the front, we see the big line, but I'm mostly concerned with what's going to be happening after the line. Do we have customers who are knowing about the processes meteorologically that can bring storms up behind the line, or are they relying on the output of the models and trusting that the meteorology in the models is capturing that? So if we can have a metric that goes after some of these problems and links it to the meteorology, but conveys the output and conveys the statistics in a story that is understandable by our customers, that's really going to be our metrics that we want to use, absolutely. And yeah, this all has costs. This is a very human problem. I think Mike highlighted that really nicely. And so we have to use a variety of different ways to get after the problems. So for the images that I have here, I have 3 different examples of ways that we have done verification, either in cases or over an aggregate of our model forecasts. We've got the turbulence case that's on the lower left here. And this is something that I haven't actually heard brought up yet today that's interesting, which is that for turbulence and icing and some of these other aviation hazards, we're really verifying on things that we're actively trying to avoid. So we have an asymmetric, reports, right? If you're not getting reports and you forecasted the turbulence well, that's good, but do you necessarily get credit for that? We want to capture that. The image for the cloud fraction, honing in on the fog, that is a little bit about process-based verification. So trying to understand what's going on within our model, specifically tied to fog formation and what we can do to enhance or detract, from the amount of fog that is being forecasted to bring it closer to OBS. And then the image on the upper right is actually one of my favorites, not just because these are model forecasts of as you go up through the upper air, but you'll notice there's this big spike kind of at the second horizontal line from the bottom. And what that actually was when we went in and looked at it a little bit is that we had a faulty observation that got into our data set of observations. And so because all of the models were indicating that something was weird at that point in the plot, we were able to dive in and uncover what actually was going on. So these are 3 different types of stories that we can get from our statistics. I think that we really need to do a good job at connecting these because of what was mentioned this morning. Something really interesting that I heard was that when staffing got tight, it was objective verification that went. And I think that's because it's a very hard problem to connect these objective statistics to the end user needs. And we don't necessarily have the best metrics to do that all the time. So I really wanted to provoke conversation with this. I certainly don't have the answers. I've got some things that we have tried to get after this problem, but I'd really like to, engage with everyone there to get your ideas on how we can do this connection of statistics to story. Thank you.
Thanks, Berkeley. Yeah, Berkeley certainly wanted to privately listening on site.
Oh no, all I heard from that was my name. It was a little garbled. Now I'm scared.
You were heaps of praise were being sent your way for the, well, what I said before, being comprehensive and concise. Master class.
I've been wrestling with this question all morning. I'm Heather Reeves from OU, and I've been wrestling with a question in my mind all morning, and it's who's responsible for what when it comes to the TCF? Should the AWC try to do an all-in-one thing where they're doing both the weather and the impact? Or should the AWC just report on the weather because they're meteorologists and that's what their expertise is? And then the impact is decided by somebody who does air traffic control. Who's responsible for what with the TCF? Because if you're trying to have the AWC do everything, maybe that's beyond their expertise. Maybe they don't know what Delta Airlines knows about some special, thing. Or yeah, should the weather just be independent of things like the day of the week or the time of the day, or the fact that the Olympic Games are happening over here, and it's just the weather, and then the user defines, I can ignore that because it's not relevant to me. I don't know what people think about that.
So I'm sure.
Joel has an obvious opinion right now. Yeah.
I was there when it was created, so I was in the room, so I can answer that because I remember Matt was there. I believe John Kozak online was there. We were in a room. I know that we met. Was during that trip out to AWC with the weather evaluation team, the CDM.
Oh,
was out there. And we came up with the TCF at that meeting, if I recall correctly. And I remember getting upset at John Kozak because it was an acronym, and we have too many of those in government. But in a serious sense here, the idea was that yes, the National Weather Service, the Aviation Weather Center, and the NAMs over there at the command center were supposed to put together the first draft of the weather center. They were supposed to sit there and say, this is what meteorology does. And is that one of the issues that they had been running into prior to this meeting was that the CWSUs always try to politicize it. We don't want that polygon in Atlanta Center's airspace because that's going to make the TMU go crazy, blah, blah, blah. And we sat down and we said, we don't care. We said the weather is going to do what the weather does. We cannot change the forecast. And you would still see it on the whiteboard. I'm going to erase this. I don't want this in Atlanta Center's airspace. And you still see that.
Yes.
But the original intent was that the CWSUs and the airlines were invited into the whiteboard. That was the whole purpose of the whiteboard, was to apply that expertise so that somebody down at the CWSU could sit there and say, I just talked to my TMU, I just talked to my STMC. We think that that is going to play a really large part in our day to day. We want a little bit more focus in there on the next whiteboard or things like that where they can bring that expertise. I've been out of that now for 8 years, so I don't know what it has evolved into, but the original intention in that room at AWC was to bring in the expertise, the CWSUs, to talk with their TMUs. And yes, we understand that the TCF was running 24/7 kind of thing, and so overnight you may not have that expertise. But that was the intention, was to have the CWSUs talk to STMCs, talk to TMUs, have Delta Mets talk with the dispatchers, talk with the air traffic folks, and bring in those impacts and say, we feel like this is not going to work for us because these impacts aren't really being addressed.
Or if you put that there, that has a really big impact because you've got, a lot of events this weekend, you've got a race down at Atlanta Motor Speedway, we've got a lot of private traffic coming, whatever it is, they were supposed to bring that expertise. But again, I don't know what it has evolved into, but that was the intention of the TCM.
Is that
So I
something that exists? Sorry, is that something that exists for after the fact as well, or is that more real time? Because I think another thing we can get caught up in is the next event. You've got to get forecasts out for the next thing. And looking back, is a key part of verification. So is the team that you're talking about primarily in the present, or do they go and review things as well?
There's a daily review of the TCF the day before. That's pretty short.
Yeah, it's the verification for TCF is usually done on NSR, which is at 10 o'clock, and it's a pretty quick conversation of what verified good and what didn't verify. But there's no real go back, and we made this decision based on that forecast and it was good or it was bad.
So it doesn't really feed back into like improved forecasts in the future or improved TCFs in the future.
No.
This is my opinion. But I share this with some of the other international NSPs that I work with. I think everything that Joe said is exactly the heart and spirit of what we want this considered to be, right? But it's still grounded in anecdotes and subjective collaborative accountability. I recommend that if we're going to be meteorologists for the aviation enterprise, I think the Met should be leaning more into the operation side. Have you mentioned impact? When you think about the classic mustard ketchup type, there's constraint in the middle. Impact is when you actually know demand is showing up and your weather that becomes a problem could become an issue when this traffic materializes. For constraint, it's kind of a middle ground where I can know the configuration of the airspace. I can know some of the complexities of pinch points and bottlenecks or sectors that are the width of an airway. So any type of weather in an airspace is basically going to be a problem, which raises and makes all that weather not equal. I think the Met community should have more of an ownership on that and work to cross that chasm, because I never see the other side coming meet in the middle. And we have an opportunity to make ourselves more salient and make our forecasts more valuable than making our own enterprise more valuable. If we just leave it alone. Now it's a tall ask and we get pushback and that's not my job description. Well, maybe it should be.
So let me challenge you a little bit.
Yeah.
Real quick, okay, your chance. James, we are at the end of our session. There is a 30-minute, I believe, discussion.
Yeah, I think this discussion is great. We should continue it and when we get the chance, hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes or so to kind of summarize things. So let's keep it.
I just didn't want to.
Thank you.
Okay.
So not really a challenge, but just to look at this from a different perspective, because I'm talking to John Williams online right now. John,
I've heard of John.
You've heard of John.
Yeah.
We work together frequently, and Heather's question is a question I ask John all the time. It's a question I say, hey, Heather, as the weather company, how do we do our verification to make everybody right? Because some people want to do it. And it just reminds me of something I did when I was with AWRP. I was working with NASA. Actually, I don't call it NASA here because they're going to get that. I don't mean to pick on NASA, but NASA was doing a bunch of really cool impact-based air traffic studies of pilot response. What they did was they took COSPA and they plugged it in. They said, well, they were getting results that they didn't appreciate. And the bad was because the COSPA data wasn't any good. They were getting bad weather forecasts, and they were assuming that the weather forecast was the perfect, was one of their 50 different variables that went into their project, right? So I think your point, though, is a good one, but I think we have to remember that we have to make sure that when we put an input in, it's a quality meteorological forecast, because it'll throw the entire.
Who better to start to own that? They already have that innate understanding and experience.
That's correct, but also you know, we don't want to say it's so complicated to do meteorological verification on the current data that we're just gonna stop doing it. We're gonna give you the best that we have here, and you guys figure out what to do. It's, you know, that isn't gonna help it. So you're right, but that's a question I had to tell John, by the way, that I was not sitting next to you, not prompting that. Because John, I think would have chuckled at that question, so.
Yeah, I think real quick before we go online, and I guess the way I think of it is the Mets should be doing weather, right? They shouldn't pretend to know operations. But the event, the definition of the event they're given, the event that they were given to forecast for needs to be informed by the operations. But it needs to be, but if you keep the ketchup and mustard separate, you end up with a definition, a requirements definition like the one that we saw that doesn't mean anything to anyone. So I think that's, the Mets bring the mustard, but they need to work together with the ketchup manufacturers.
It's included now.
So so way back when there was some sort of diagram and there was the weather and there was the operations and one was red and one was yellow and it became known as the ketchup and mustard diagram. So that's what I want to reference. Okay, worst to see the name. Worst description ever. I can't see the name, but I can see the name.
The one on the list is Chelsea Kenyon. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Hi, I just wanted to speak to the question about where does the TCF process stand now with AWC? Because I've been here since back in the CCFP days, so I've seen all the different iterations of it. Right now, AWC's only real feedback about how well the forecast does is the verification. And so they have a tendency to want to stick to that. So, you know, if we ask, can we go from low confidence to high confidence or from sparse to medium? Usually the answer is, well, sometimes the answer is no, because it's not going to verify. Okay, but I'm trying to paint a picture for the users. And so I want to convey the impact. They don't want to do that because it's not going to verify. That's the only feedback that they get. So they are not seeing the other side of it, which is how it impacts air traffic. AWC doesn't really have a mechanism for that. That's what the NAMs do at the command center. So I think any kind of verification that wraps that impact back in needs to come at the command center level or in some sort of a collaborative group that can look at high impact events as a group and say, okay, how did this impact these centers and how does it impact the command center? What were the decisions made? And were the forecast pieces in place in time to make those decisions? I think if we can get to that point, then maybe we are a little bit more full circle about this and not just looking at one side or the other.
It was anticipated.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out, first and foremost, thank you, Heather, and kind of going back to Randy earlier as well. Ultimately, the TCF is, it's not even close. It is by far the most collaborative product within the entire National Weather Service, and it's not even close. We actually handle the verification in-house, and it is purely subjective. Like has been mentioned earlier, there's the objective analysis that was done before. That's not really in play. It's purely subjective. Did it verify? Did it verify close? Did it verify well? Was it missed? Those are the four criteria that we have. So going back to, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the person that came here that kind of set the TCF. That has been AWC's stance all along, is to try to stick to the weather, because we're not with the TMUs. We're not in those realms. That's why we have the people in the chat room, the airlines included, for their input. We can make changes. Rarely do we ever really tell anybody, no, we're not going to change that based on verification. It just doesn't happen, because we're not the ones in the hot seats being the one that's presenting the data to you all. So we tend to lean a little bit more toward the collaborative process. That's why it's such a great product from a collaboration standpoint. So I just don't want to lose it. You know, it is, as Heather was saying, it's subjective verification, but ultimately we're not the ones making decisions from the map. So just kind of want to emphasize that. And I know I'm kind of the only one here that does the actual TCF product. So if anybody has any questions, please let me know. I mean, I'm more than happy to answer them and help out.
Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me well? I guess you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Okay. Just hello, Mike Baldwin. Sorry I'm not there to see you in person, but thanks for participating. These are post-lunch thoughts, and I swear I wasn't drinking. As a needy outsider that is an academic data junkie who tries to get students interested in all this stuff, and an infrequent storm chaser, I want a TORCON for aviation impacts on the NAS. I swear there was a paper about the NAS weather index, but it would be great in a forecast mode. And my needy self wants some TCF overlays that say, this area might need upgrading. I want data accessible to review and archives like the SPC has. I want to go back and see the big events. I want to see the forecast busts. And then I sit there and go, well, TCM is probably not sexy enough for all this. And then, oh, by the way, there's those things called airport weather warnings that are specific relationships between the Weather Service and locals like Daytona. They forecast for some very specific events. So there are some contexts for very specific weather people to do impact-based stuff that's kind of out of the weather realm. So that was my thought splatter.
You have a history? That's moved at the same time.
I'm sorry. Can I respond really quick to what Mike just said?
Yeah.
When he said, you know, TFM or TCM isn't sexy, well, maybe we should make it so. I mean, this data is a huge part of our GDP. You know, it's the engine of our country. You know, these thunderstorm days are crushing. We have that, but we don't have the right metrics to actually tell that story. What if we started telling that story? Not maybe to us, but the enterprise. I mean, it actually is sexy. If you knew a garden variety thunderstorm event cost you 50,000 hours of delay and 80% of that was avoidable, holy crap. You know, I don't know, to me, there's nothing sexier, but I'm very biased. You know, it goes back to messaging and narrative. We have an opportunity to, you know, drive this narrative around some of this evidence if we really could get the flow of it.
Yeah, but might be a naive question, but it's sort of a follow-up to this comment and the discussion that's been happening. And the main naive part is whether or not it's something that's around feasibility and it's this is talking about verification, right? Talking about the TCR, is there an opportunity to do some kind of layered approach where like layer one is just the opportunities? This is the event, this is the probability of the event, or whatever it is. And then the second layer is built by a team of the sort of folks who have the different operational needs, and then what's the cost translation, the risk assessment based on that layer? Yes.
I mean, what I'm hearing described here is exactly what the Weather Service does in their integrated warning team meetings, right? So they bring together all of those different parts of those layers and do, you know, a post-mortem or whatever you want to call it, together, work through those scenarios and understand what broke down, what didn't, and how it can be better in the future. And then that builds those communities doing that. It sounds like a real time. Yeah. So I'd like to figure out what those are.
So there are products like that now. They do it off of things that can be parsed like the HER, Weather avoidance field is what, 16 years old? Maybe not this week, but this year. The CWAP that's going into NWP, these are all translation products that are built off the model. If the TCF, again, do we build it off of what it purports to be or what it actually validates to us? There's two different definitions there. Can I parse those probabilities inside those polygons and understand those better? Then maybe I could use it. But for me, again, maybe it's just me being a little bit ignorant. I struggle with actually trying to ingest the TCF for those types of products, because even an individual polygon can be, the data inside it could be interpreted in a number of different ways. I struggle with that.
Well, we're at almost 2:30, so I think this is a good discussion. We have about 15 minutes to kind of digest what was discussed these 3 topic sessions.
You need to get up now.
Yeah.
People are at the session.
Yeah, I'm gonna get up. I don't know what I'm gonna say, but.
That's okay. Whatever you say, the same.
Yeah, say it right to the microphone. Great discussion. I really appreciate, first of all the contributions from the panelists from this morning and this afternoon. I think that was a very stimulating discussion. A lot of topics were brought up through the course of this session. We really wanted to focus it, I would say, more toward like the current requirements, but you can't talk about just the requirements without knowing sort of what the products are currently that are being used in the decision-making process. And so that's why the TCF was brought up quite a bit. Clearly there's a disconnect, because when you look at the requirements that Mike Robinson put up there, that's just one of them. There's pages and pages of them like that in the document. They don't really align with the current product that's out there at all. It's definitely a fish. And I believe that there's a lot of room for improvement, and I hope a lot of this group does too. The question is, can we build enough of a consensus, a need from the users, a need from the atmospheric side of things, the meteorologists, to all get together and do it, because it's a lot of work. But like Mike said, there's probably hundreds of millions of dollars of potential savings that could be had if we could do it right. So I just want to get kind of people's perspectives here. What do we do next? Do we try to form a tiger team? Is that one possible outcome of this session, to look into this a little bit more? If we do, how do we fund that work? People are pretty busy doing other things, but again, they're potentially passionate about this problem as well. So maybe there's enough interest that we can do it just grassroots type effort. I don't know. I talked a little bit about some of the things that came out. We really talked a lot about performance-based requirements potentially as an avenue of moving forward. But one of the issues with that is then you've got to figure out a way to translate. If you're going to verify the performance, you're going to have to figure out a way to translate that back to model developers so they know what their predictions might be to. Bless you. Wow, double. You got to translate it back to the virtual. Translate it back to something that the model developers can take and say, oh, we can improve on this, we can improve on that aspect of the forecast by doing various research topics and improving model physics or the data simulation. So there were a couple of metrics that we've been looking at that are somewhat more designed for aviation interests, like permeability, or looking specifically at the timing of storms onset, their peak in terms of coverage, and then their cessation. Doing that type of verification relative to airspace structures could be of more value than just doing a rolled up CSI score POD. So those are some of the areas that we're looking now, but that's probably not exactly the answer either. So we really need to get everybody, all the stakeholders or partners in the room together and start really trying to hash out what is needed to move forward. Got to start with something. It may not be perfect, so there may be an iterative process, and it may take a few years to get something in place. As you heard from Brandon Smith earlier, it's not a quick process to do new requirements, but it may be something that's worth looking into a little bit more. So it's might be.
I just have one comment. I definitely think a Tiger team would be of interest, but I think even before that, going back to the process that Brandon laid out this morning, we had so many moving parts across this team today. If in the parlance of the FAA likes to show up to problems, they like to start with a problem statement. Can we even effectively craft and capture what the problem is with all its moving parts? And then can we start to lay out what could be the path towards a solution before we even decide to meet as a Tiger team? Just get down succinctly what we all think we understand of the problem. Yeah, it's not easy to even get it.
Yeah, like 2 sentences. Can we get back to 2 sentences?
Yeah.
If a small group could put together 1 or 2 succinct problem statements, in my view, that would be over 3/4 of the approval technique, because that's not an easy thing to just lay down here to come up with 1 or 2 succinct problems.
But there's tools out there to do it. Google Docs, you can just keep going back and forth and hashing it out. Getting enough people in there looking at it. Probably end up with 1,000 comments that we have.
Well, and that's my point, is the 1,000 comments, making sense of all of that.
Yeah.
Because we have heard stuff that's, I mean, like you brought up the Randy Baker UPS example of the frost, and it's a wonderful example, but it's 2-dimensional. It's either this or it's that.
Yeah.
Convection has about 43 to the 5th power dimensions with it, and yeah, I struggle with how to actually order that.
That's why I think it's important for us to just try to wrestle this to the ground a little bit. We can't do everything at once.
Yeah.
Nor do we even know how, or do we even know where to start?
Yeah.
So how do we unpack this? And again, if we can get to some of those problem statements. But again, towards what end? What are we trying to achieve here?
Oh,
And not do the same thing we've been discussing for the last 20 years.
that's actually really easy, and it was a focal point for the, sorry, Joel Siegel, FAA. Thank you. The ANG, so, Next Gen, ANGC6 led the FAA weather strategy, real recently. Matt and I were just talking about this over lunch. One of the focal points that kept coming up over and over and over and over again is the human factor, the part of you're essentially providing a weather product to people who don't speak weather, people who need the weather translated to them. So how do you give them a single authoritative source that says, you will use this? You will use this every single day of your career, and you will not sway from using this product, so that everybody can be predictive, right? We've got Delta who can predict what was going to happen because they look at the weather source and say, yep, this is what they're going to do. You could have United looking at this and say, yep, this is how they're going to react. Giving the air traffic controllers, the TMUs, the STMCs, the CWSUs, the NAMs, the NOMs, whoever it is that's dealing with making that decision, give them a single authoritative source for weather and tell them this is what you're going to use, because right now they make so many different decisions based off of so many different sites.
But Joel, isn't that going back to my reality versus dream? We've been talking about single authoritative source for 20 years.
I know.
That doesn't exist. That's even never exists.
I wouldn't say never.
Yeah.
We just got a huge amount of money into the FAA to build this brand new air traffic control system. Granted, half of it's going to TD and IP, but still, I still think that with us having some focus around this idea that we could probably.
Even before that, don't we want to discuss here again, what would be the requirements that would define that? And I mean, part of it,
yes.
I mean, it's important. When I hear single authoritative source, I feel back to starting. What does that mean? How are we going to get there? I don't know.
It's kind of.
I think it's got a new definition now.
Okay.
Okay, I'm on board then.
I don't know what it is. Yeah, it's just because.
I don't know what it is.
Ask Gemini.
Ask Gemini.
Kevin Johnson?
Hey, hi. Yeah, so Joe, to your point, that was in part one of the reasons why we changed the name of CCFP after cause failed to the TCF. So it was, everybody knew it was TFM convective forecast because they were using so many different things. And we wanted, since we were spending a lot of effort there to collaborate amongst the Weather Service Mets and industry Mets, it's like, hey, we're spending resources, so do that. They're looking at things like COSPA and these other tools that have come along since the original collaborative forecast. But you need to use it, and the operator needs to give us feedback on how well it's working for them. That was the intent of getting weather better included in the daily NSR, as well as PERDI. And if those processes are not providing the ops feedback to us as far as how well that forecast is helping them, it sounds like we're not executing things that are in place. So I don't know. I'd rather try to exploit the things that are in place that the operators are doing and using to try to, again, get the feedback on how well the Mets are performing.
The good news is that I believe that there is movement between FAA and NOAA to try and figure out what these holds the ratings for aviation weather.
Kind of movement.
That I don't know.
Oh. It was just a discussion at this point. Yeah, that's just getting back to Kevin's point. So still kind of begs the need for a better definition of what the forecast skill requirements are, because as we've seen today, they're not.
Well, I've been being
kind of
quiet. I've been
Yeah.
being quiet on this. Those performance requirements are not for TCF. They're for Thunderstorms.
Sure.
And that was work that started, I want to say, in 2011 with industry, with a lot of FAA operators. And then it went through a whole bunch of simulation work that Cheryl Sodders organized around next gen segment. I don't know if it was Bravo, Charlie. I think it was supposed to be in place by 2025, but that was 10 years prior. And I trust that that work was all good and they validated these requirements. Yes, it's the TCF forecast that is provided for en route. I would argue that it's the TAF that is used to support the convective decision making for your terminal locations. And a lot of those requirements were for the core 30 airports. So, and when we sat down and looked at the en route piece, we did fixate on AFP's, the areas for AFP 5 and 8. So it was the Northeast. And we always felt that those requirements could be changed for other areas of the NAS for en route. So, yeah, I mean, today it's the TCF, tomorrow it could be something else. But I think those requirements are pretty valid.
Interesting opinion. Yeah, so it's sort of a range here, then current models can't get anywhere near that level of accuracy. And the other issue
I don't disagree with you, but I guess that doesn't mean it's not a requirement.
No, I just think that it's potential here to look at different metrics to formulate the requirements that are more aviation centric in terms of like permeability or maybe like the orientations of storms, because we need to be able to feed back issues with the macro scale properties and the forecasts back to the model developers so that they can improve their forecasts. So it seems like there's an opportunity here to look at, like Mike Robinson said, what is the problem statement here? Can we do better than what we're doing now? Are there last minute comments, thoughts? It's going to be a lot of material to digest from the transcripts, I'm sure. Hopefully Jim and I can do a good job.
So who are using? I mean, can I just do an analogy really quick?
Yeah.
I mean, we are now, we have a POD requirement of 75% for a 4-hour forecast. First convection this big. Doing my hand here.
20 nautical miles.
Thank you. And if we feel like we're never going to get close to that anytime soon, something like technology, that's a very, very long reach. That's like HHS coming down on big pharmacy for any type of new therapeutic you're going to use for cancer. Your requirement is it must cure cancer. Yeah, that's great. We all aspire for that, but we're never going to reach that uniformly. So what's the value of this? What do we do with it? What do we do with requirements like that?
It's a good point. And also, as we talked about a lot today, convective weather prediction is inherently probabilistic. So there needs to be a component of a statement, the problem statement of looking at the reliability of an ensemble prediction of the forecasts, some aspect of that. Whether it's permeability or storm organization or, throughput, even translate it, throughput through a sector. It's the probability we're going to be able to get 30 aircraft per hour, something like that. That's translated. So model developers won't be able to take that and do much with it really, unless they know, oh, it's because we've got too many storms, too close together, or they're too big, or that kind of thing. But it still could be another step in the right direction. But it's going to take some figuring. We have another.
Doug Lauder, you dispatch, asked the question of, how do you evaluate the permit? Actually, throughout days, and we still subjecting, because there could be solid weather across the was like, that comes from Pennsylvania.
Sure, you could actually have enough aircraft.
On your spacing, when you're still having impact, it's so much fun. So, answer that some so what's the value of this particular?
Yeah,
so there's capacity and then there's how much are you pushing. Now, Wandishin, I'll let you guys out. I mean, if you've got a pipe, if the pipe, if you've got buildup within the pipe that you're not able to push as much water to, that's there whether or not the pipe is empty or if you're trying to drain more water. Obviously, it matters more when you're in central Pennsylvania and you've got a lot of water, you've got to drain through that pipe. But the permeability is just, is it possible? Is there room to put those through? And that's an objective measure, and that's what we can do. Now, and this gets further verification from a DAS perspective, it makes sense to weight parts of the country different times of day. Your weighting's not even everywhere for judgment performance, so that it matters more to get it right in the Northeast than it does across. But and so that makes sense for that sense. But you also need to know the unweighted stuff against our feedback so that the modelers can actually know where we go about so they can improve their forecast. So I think it's related to the aspiration versus requirement. It's good to have that goal to shoot for, but you also need reasonable steps to maybe succeed in moving in the right direction.
The counter argument to that is that you don't care about proving the forecast over Montana, because it doesn't matter. Where you really care about it is over the Northeast, where maybe there's different environmental conditions that lead to different types of weather that are different, forecasted differently than over Montana. For example, MCSs tend to hit Montana. They're more predictable. They're easier to forecast. Northeast has got just a hodgepodge of all sorts of different types of weather that are inherently less predictable. So it's interesting. But I think we're at the end.
start the session.
Yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay. So Mike, would you agree with this though, that pipe, permeability of that pipe, right? That's the real problem. But if we can't forecast what's in the pipe very well, then we certainly can't forecast it as permeable.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're disagreeing, I don't think challenging you by saying.
No, you still can't take the weather into
Yeah,
right?
you gotta take the weather.
Yeah, for sure.
There's still that part of the problem, and I think we gotta make sure we don't forget about it.
I think that Nathan Holtman United, sorry, I was late.
Yeah, wait, we have a new entrant. This is number 47.
Congratulations. It's good to be here. I was really bummed that I missed this morning, but for good reasons. But so, just already talked about this whole concept of permeability has been in my brain as well. To talk about it at United, it's probably every airline this. I mean, if you consider at the end of the day, we're trying to model pilot's behavior and perception, right? And a pilot's perception of whether or not they should go in that area is based on their view of the weather. So, you consider the human factors of how they're viewing the radar display, how it's being communicated to them from the dispatchers, what they're hearing over the radio. There's so many factors in how a pilot perceives a area. Hey, I'm not going to go through that. So, a fix closes in the Northeast. My understanding is that it's basically because the pilot said, no, I'm not going. Okay, so why did they say they're not going? What were they looking at that led them to believe that they shouldn't build it? Yeah.
Yeah, Mike Robinson Harris, sorry, I'm speaking all day and not doing that. There were a series of studies years ago, Lincoln did this when they were trying to build their RAP tool.
Yeah.
And what they found at one point, trying to get out of the Northeast was, and RAP was just blowing it on these really small, low top cold pool convection. Because the pilots coming out of New York, think about what cold pool convection looks like. Clear skies, humidity's gone, big rocky cauliflowers, not very tall, but man, it looks like something, and I have all the space around me, I can go right around it, right? So it was blowing up the algorithms. So, that human factors piece is really, the other piece to the point about permeability and Steve about, the weather intelligence piece. The weather piece is still, I like to skip past it. You guys are meteorologists, skip past the weather and get to the constraints. But man, even in this notion of what is constraining convection, when I was at Lincoln years ago and we were adopting New York with availability planning tool to Chicago, lift and shift, how different can the weather be? And the thing, we were just false alarming all over the place, saying all these routes were red everywhere. And they had these big dying MCSs that had level 5, 35, 40,000 feet of benign, low rising, hydrometeor seeded stratiform. And these flights were just pumping out all the west tracks, south tracks, and we were having them dead red. So we had to change the entire algorithm because our definition of what was a constraining convection was New York centric. And it wasn't right for this airspace. Chicago's not New York. As a New Yorker, I can say that, but it's pretty important airspace. So the weather piece still isn't fixed or understood by any stretch of the imagination. That's what makes it so hard.
Christian Emerald, Greenland Pilot Association. Seven Airbus captain, United. It's my main job. So there's a lot of psychology to that too. Mike Baldwin's slide, sensitivity to false alarms. I have greater sensitivity to false alarms on the last day before a 5-day trip. I just want to go. There was 2 summers ago, every trip I flew seemed to end with a penalty lap to Oregon. In the summer. And we get there, no problem, and we see the storms over central Pennsylvania, and then we get there, swap and go into effect, and I put my head in my hands. And, I remember being in line to go. I said, hey, we think we've got a roof. You're a little tight with that airplane. You can get around there. Amazing how quickly you figure out what you can do with your airplane and find space when it's the last day of the trip. Yeah, let's go. I'm not going to do anything unsafe once we get in the air. But if you give me a path to go, I'm going to go. So